veces a mi hermana. No, en calle.
Ready to go?
Bueno,
You ready to go, James? Ready to go? Alright, cool. So we're gonna I'll start with the introductions. Okay, good evening, folks. How y'all doing? So good to see you. My name is Kazimbe Balagoon. I'm a project manager with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. I want to welcome you to this public roundtable, the Greece of the Caribbean, Puerto Rico's debt crisis. We have a very esteemed panel tonight, and very excited to dig deep into this topic. I also just want to mention really quickly that we do have some literature in the back, on the back end table. Also, this program will be live streamed, our first live stream from the office. For the folks at home, hi. And so we're definitely very excited. There's also some seats on the side over here, the orange couch. A couple, I think one seat in the front. And we'll try to accommodate as many people as possible. But certainly make yourselves comfortable, make yourselves at home. We also have some water, make yourselves feeling at home. Just a little bit before we get into the conversation, a little bit about what brought us here tonight. I think this panel really reflects an interest of in this particular office in bringing together progressive actors to think about strategies and solutions against the current crisis of austerity. This crisis is not only affecting us economically, but it's really challenging our very notion of what democracy is. Indeed, Puerto Rico right now is being buried in over $70 billion in debt and is in danger of default. This fiscal meltdown has shifted all aspects of the island and has led to slashes in the public sector. Also has led to massive migration to the mainland, which is also shifting the political landscape of this election season too. What I think we talked about earlier, what Jose would talk about a little bit earlier too. This toxic cocktail of austerity, debt, and lack of democratic governance has led Puerto Rico to be called the quote-unquote Greece of the Caribbean. In fact, the German finance minister joked with his U.S. counterpart and said, "I'll trade you Puerto Rico for Greece," to show you the kind of international connections that are going on here. So as the crisis is deepening, I think that both we on the mainland, as well as our comrades and our brothers and sisters on islands, are trying to figure out what progressive solutions look like. And also connect that also to the long-standing question of Puerto Rico's colonial status to the United States. So we have a very esteemed panel, as you can see. And first of all, I'm just happy that we had the weather we had today. I felt bad asking Sophia. and Sophia could come from Puerto Rico, and Jose to come from Florida. And it was like less than 70 degrees. So I think that, the spirit is with us. So they have nice weather today for our brothers and sisters from Puerto Rico and from Florida. So I'm actually introduce them in the order they're going to be speaking in. The first speaker will be Juan Gonzalez. He's a longtime activist, one of the founders of the New York chapter of the Young Lords Party, and currently a columnist for the New York Daily News, and the co-host of Democracy Now! Followed by Sofia Galicia Mir.
I know, it's rough.
Yeah.
Galicia Muriente.
Thank you, soul sister. She's a film director and part of Beta Local, a collective of artists and activists in Puerto Rico. She was also very instrumental in both Occupy Wall Street as well as Occupy Sandy, a people-led relief effort in Far Rockaway after Hurricane Sandy. And last but not least, we are joined by Jose Alejandro La Luz. He is a longtime trade unionist, current chair of the Democratic Socialists of America, and an active member with the Stand with Puerto Rico Coalition. So please welcome our guests. So we're going to start off with Juan, who will give an overview of the crisis as it relates to the mainland.
well, good evening.
I'm just going to try to give sort of an informal, a quick overview. I've done a bunch of presentations in the last few months that gives it a more detail, and obviously the situation is changing day by day, so you have to sort of keep up with the latest stuff that's been happening. But my basic approach to this has been good evening. There are really, I'm just going to try to give sort of an informal crisis, a quick overview. I've done a bunch of presentations are represented by the situation in Puerto Rico right now. Detail, and one is an immediate financial and budgetary crisis that has led the Puerto Rico government to actually default already twice on some bond payments, but not to the point where the bondholders are demanding immediate restructuring of their debt. And the other is a much more long-term situation, which is decades now of economic stagnation in Puerto Rico that can be directly traced to the colonial situation which the island has been under for 117, going on 118 years. That while they're related, they are actually distinct, and there's a problem that one requires an immediate response, and the other requires a response, and not a continued postponement of a response. And so that I think that in that sense they're both connected. As was mentioned, it's about 73 billion in overall debt. It's a very complicated debt situation because the Puerto Rico government has, over the years, created all kinds of what you might call off-the-books companies, which are entities, public entities, so that it takes a lot of work to actually track the debt, who owes it, and what kind of guarantees there are on it. But that basically, what happened for the immediate budgetary crisis was that. As I've said, I think Puerto Rico went through three forms of colonialism, or three stages of the colonial experiment that the United States has conducted on the island. The first 50 years was the phase of resource extraction, which was basically turning Puerto Rico into a monocrop sugar economy, exploiting the agricultural workforce, taking out of Puerto Rico the goods that the country was producing. That sort of became untenable following the end of World War II and the rise of the anti-colonial movements around the world. And the United States had to explain away the fact that it had fought for liberty but was holding a colony. So after the United Nations was created, the government came up with this idea of self-government, of autonomy for Puerto Rico that became the personification of which was the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Estado Libre Asociado. Which basically had a whole new approach to colonialism. One, there was a more social democratic policy for the labor force. There are all kinds of things in the Puerto Rico Constitution that even the U.S. Constitution doesn't have in terms of supposed rights that the people have. They turned back the language because the United States had changed the language of the public schools. And of course, the English had turned it back to Spanish when Muñoz Marin, the Popular Party, really came to power. So they adopted a much more sort of a benign form of colonialism, and now more dependent on cheap labor, industrialization of the island and cheap labor. However, that began to run out of steam after a few decades, and by the 70s you got the period of what's now been this constant stagnation of the economy. So what the government, the U.S. government, came up with in conjunction with the local Puerto Rican elites was in 1976 they devised this thing called the 936 tax credit, which was an effort to get lower American companies to come to the island for cheap, not only for cheap labor, which they had been doing since the 40s, but now for complete tax benefits, a complete tax exemption. So you had an explosion of factories that developed, especially pharmaceutical factories. In 1976, they devised this thing called all kinds of companies that depended heavily on R&D, was an effort to get and could exploit their intellectual property to get huge profits, and that's complicated, but I can explain to you for those of you who are interested. But basically, what then happened was in '96, the Clinton administration was trying to get reelected, and they needed to raise the federal minimum wage in the United States. So they needed the support of the Republicans in Congress, who at that time were being pretty much run by Newt Gingrich and the right-wing revolution of the Republicans. So Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton cut a deal, which is that Gingrich would support a rise in the minimum wage in the United States, but in exchange, the Republicans wanted about $7 billion in tax credits for small businesses in the United States that would be affected by the rise in the minimum wage. So what happened is, Clinton, because there were balanced budget requirements, Clinton had to come up with $7 billion, and it just so happened that about $7 billion was the value of the tax exemptions that the 936 corporations in Puerto Rico were receiving. So in essence, the Clinton administration traded the Puerto Rico tax credits to 936 corporations in exchange for a deal to raise the minimum wage and for him to get reelected. So what happened is they made a deal that the 936 credits would be phased out over 10 years. So it started in 96, and it was gradually 20% a year, 20% a year, 20%, until they came to 2006. And by 2006, the entire tax credits were gone. All the companies fled. So the best manufacturing jobs in Puerto Rico of the stage 2 of colonialism suddenly fled when there were no longer the tax benefits. So then, from that point on, from 2006 on, if you look at all the reports, they all date the plummeting of the Puerto Rico economy since 2006. And the government, faced with the fact that it could no longer pay for the social contract that it had established under Commonwealth with its labor force, then began not only cutting, but it also began to borrow to be able to stay, to meet a budget deficit. So you had the explosion of debt that has occurred largely since the early 2000s, where the debt of Puerto Rico pretty much like tripled, and I call this the new, I call it uber colonialism or total financial control of Puerto Rico's economy. The first was agricultural resource extraction, the second was industrialization, the third was finance capital, completely running the island through debt. And that's what we're in right now. So basically that's what's happened. The budgetary crisis is only the latest manifestation, but it is distinct from the trajectory of constant colonialism. Now, what's made it more difficult for the Puerto Rico government, as opposed to the Greek government, which has actually more independence than Puerto Rico does, is that Puerto Rico can't go to the IMF because it's not a country, a recognized country in the international world. So it can't go to the IMF and seek one of those terrible IMF bailouts. It also cannot, the Puerto Rico government cannot also file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, which most states can allow their municipalities, like Detroit or New York State could allow New York, or to file for a restructuring of their debts to make the bondholders wait longer or get less of their principal in order to be able to get some breathing room for the economy to grow again. So the problem is that because it's in this netherworld, and none of the press, none of the commercial press talk about it as colonialism. They all talk about it as, well, it's this unusual situation. Hi, Francis. Hey, Francis. This unusual situation. And that's basically what's happened. The result has been that the problem has been that Congress has always determined what happens in Puerto Rico, despite the claims of self-government that were made to the United Nations back in the 1950s. Puerto Rico still falls under something that's called the territorial clause of the Constitution. It's a particular portion of the U.S. Constitution which basically says Congress has the right to make all rules and regulations respecting the territories of the United States. And no matter what they may claim Puerto Rico is, it remains a territory, a possession of the United States. And as a result, it's really up to Congress what happens in Puerto Rico on any major issue. So back in 1984, Congress decided that Puerto Rico would no longer be able to use Chapter 9 bankruptcy, even though it had been able to use it for decades before. The law was changed. And many of you have heard about the Jones Act, that requires all shipping in and out of Puerto Rico to be on U.S. flag, U.S. manned, and U.S. built ships, which immediately raises the cost of everything that comes in and out of Puerto Rico. Well, the Jones Act was passed by Congress, that Jones Act, because there was a 17 Jones Act that gave citizenship, the 22 Jones Act was the shipping laws. The Virgin Islands is exempted from the Jones Act by Congress. The Virgin Islands is another U.S. possession, but does not have the Jones Act in effect. So why does the Virgin Islands, a much smaller territorial possession of the United States, exempted from the Jones Act, and Puerto Rico, a much bigger, much more lucrative economy, subjected to the Jones Act? It's purely the decision of Congress. It has no other, nothing else than the fact that Congress feels like doing that and feels that it can do that when it comes to Puerto Rico. So whether it's the Jones Act or the bankruptcy protection or a myriad of other situations, the reality is all the major decisions that affect Puerto Rico are determined by Congress. So the battle right now is, okay, you are still insisting that Puerto Rico is legally a territory of the United States subjected to the rules of Congress. Well, you've got to do something about the current financial and debt crisis of Puerto Rico. The minimum, which would be to allow a restructuring of the debts that the Puerto Rico government would be able to do and force these bondholders to take what they call in Wall Street a haircut, big haircut, little haircut, but take a haircut on their bonds and do something about the Jones Act. Now, the problem with the Jones Act is this dirty secret of the Jones Act is the labor movement doesn't want to touch it because the maritime unions, insist on keeping the Jones Act because it guarantees them members in the merchant marine. And so the AFL-CIO is quietly agreeing to the maritime unions' demands. Don't talk about the Jones Act. So you notice that even some of our best representatives in Congress are not talking about the Jones Act right now. They keep talking about just Chapter 9 or super bankruptcy, which is called this thing called super bankruptcy that's being debated now. Meanwhile, everyone knows, and you'll hear from the other two speakers, what the effect has been in Puerto Rico. It's really devastating what's been occurring. It's continuing to occur. The situation in the healthcare system, the housing. One report that I saw said that 1/3 of all the housing in Puerto Rico is empty. Right? Forget about this problem we have here. There are literally thousands and thousands of empty housing units in Puerto Rico because there was an overbuilding during the crisis, before the crisis, the housing crisis, then all the flight of people who have left the island. So you have an enormous stockpile of empty housing in Puerto Rico, which is driving down the prices of everyone else's houses because there's no demand for housing in Puerto Rico. And that's creating huge asset loss for the general population. So you've got all these problems, and it's a question that this has to be resolved quickly. May 1, Puerto Rico government owes $440 million in the next big debt payment coming up. July 1, they owe $2 billion in a debt payment that's coming up. And there's no money. There's no money for this. So there's no doubt that the government is going to default big time. Not little, it's done 15 million here, 100 million there, but now it's going to have a big time default coming either in May or in July. And the point that I've been making, and why Puerto Rico is America's Greece, the Caribbean's Greece is apt, is that this has the potential to create a huge problem for the entire municipal bond market in the United States. And that's it's not just a Puerto Rico problem, it's an American financial industry problem. That's why you get so much coverage in the Wall Street and in the business press on this on a daily basis. Because the problem is for decades, Puerto Rico was this little gold mine for people who invested in bonds. It was a little gold mine that only people who had a lot of money to buy bonds, because if you buy New York City bonds, let's say from the Port Authority or from the Department of Education or let's say some other bonds. So maybe you have some money, you want to put your retirement income in a bond as opposed to stocks. You get like 3% interest today or 2% interest on the bonds. The last bonds that Puerto Rico floated in March of 2014 for $3 billion, the last ones that were allowed to, which the hedge funds all bought up, were paying 8% interest. 8%, not 3 or 4%, 8% interest. And if you're a high net worth individual, and you're getting triple tax exempt bonds, which you're exempt from federal, state, and local taxes, that means that that's worth to you like a 12, 15% return. Now, who wouldn't buy that? Who wouldn't buy a bond that gives you 12%, 15% interest every year? So all of these mutual funds, Oppenheimer and Templeton, they were all stocking up their bond portfolios of Puerto Rico bonds, and the hedge funds were dying to get them because they're great return, as long as they're being paid. That's a great return as long as the government pays them. And they had the guarantee that Congress wouldn't allow Puerto Rico to go bankrupt, so they had to pay. Right? So there was almost like a foolproof guarantee, 12%, 15% return on your money. That was the great secret, and that's all exploded now. And all of these were triple tax, not only triple tax exempt bonds, they were AAA rated by what's called insurance companies. And now these insurance companies, of which there are only a few, are now on the hook to pay the bondholders that the Puerto Rico government doesn't pay. They have to pay the bondholders because they insured the bonds. And so you have the potential for the entire insurance industry for municipal bonds to collapse if Puerto Rico doesn't pay its bonds, because the insurers don't have the money to reimburse bondholders for these bonds. And that will mean that all AAA rated bonds throughout the United States will suddenly not be AAA rated, because the insurers who insured them don't have the money to pay them. And so you're going to have every municipality and every state in the government, in the country, that goes to float bonds is going to have to pay higher interest rates and pay more money just to finance their projects. So you're going to have a ripple effect throughout the entire municipal bond industry. That's what I call the Achilles heel of the whole situation, which is the bond insurance companies and the municipal bond market. And so it's not just a question of saving Puerto Rico. It's a question of saving the municipal bond market of the United States from a major shock if something is not done very quickly in the next few months to resolve the problem. So that's it in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you so much. We're going to turn next to Sophia.
So, first off, I'm really happy to be here. So, thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for inviting me, and thank you, Kaz. And like Kazemba said, I'm an artist and I work in an arts organization. So, this has also been a really great opportunity for me to kind of clarify and weave together some ideas and some experiences from the past couple of years, trying to understand what's happening right now, specifically because it's such a difficult issue to grasp in its everyday manifestations, especially if you're not an economist. So I'm really happy to be here, and I also feel like it's particularly fitting to come to New York to speak about this, because it's always been kind of a vital task of Puerto Ricans throughout our history to come to New York and try to raise some awareness and some solidarity with Puerto Rican causes, precisely because of what Juan was saying earlier about us not having representation in Congress, and Congress being the one legislative body that actually does have a say in what happens in our country. So I feel I should clarify just, for a moment that I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, lived here for 9 years and was a part of Occupy, and have been back in the island for the past 2.5 years. I know about a lot of things that are happening in Puerto Rico, and I'm connected to a network of people and projects that are very interesting, and people that are doing important work right now. But I'm not, by no means am I an economic expert. It was a real challenge to know where to start from today in this presentation. I felt at first like maybe I had to push back a little bit against the title of today's event, but I think Juan has already also covered a little bit about what makes that Greece comparison a little more complicated. Specifically, our colonialism, our colonial relationship to the U.S., and also I think it's important to highlight like the fact that we have such a different history and cultural of political resistance. And I don't think it's necessary to dwell on this very much, but I know there were plenty of us dreaming of a Varoufakis of some kind emerging in Puerto Rico. It has not been the case. And the comparison has been a way for many people outside of Puerto Rico to really establish that sense of urgency when talking about this island whose history has always been a little elusive and confusing for folks. So if it helps, draw a curious crowd and bring people to understand our situation, I welcome it. But Cass also invited me to speak today, thinking that perhaps I could speak in some way about the response of social movements to the current crisis. And that really kind of worried me enormously because I think if there's one way to describe it so far, it's underwhelming, at least, especially in the island. I know you're going to speak about what, Puerto Rican communities throughout the U.S. have been doing, which is very important and significant. But definitely in Puerto Rico, the response in terms of massive organization or resistance has been quite underwhelming. I wouldn't know where to start to enumerate the reasons for this lack of organization and resistance, but I can say that it's the result of a combination of factors, and I'll name some. First of all, I think there's a completely discredited political class and a broken electoral system that independent candidates and new parties have been trying to break into for the past 3 elections unsuccessfully. There's a massive exodus that has shrunk the population by 10% in the last 10 years and is currently providing a way out for around 3,000 people every week who cannot or will not continue to fight against the circumstances in the island and would rather use their education and language skills and citizenship to succeed elsewhere, as has happened throughout our history as well. There's a deeply entrenched political culture that has not been able to find the will or the way to propose a common cause to push for in this debate. There's a profoundly splintered left that's overly reliant on traditional organizational models and a rhetoric that has also gotten quite old and weak in the last 30 years, after the dissolution of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, perhaps one could say. There's also the institutionalization and the co-optation of many young leaders and promising figures that acquired visibility after the glorious student strike of the University of Puerto Rico in 2009 and 2010. There's a wide generational divide in the distribution of political power, knowledge, and experience. There's quite a mediocre corporate press. There's a turn towards conservative values in the religious community that's so readily mobilized in the past. There's a lack of spaces and funding for independent thought and organizing, like that provided by foundations, think tanks, or nonprofits in places like New York. I could go on, but I would rather we don't all live here depressed, so I'm going to stop. I brought a video. Can we play it? So I figured I'd soften the blow by playing this collage of publicity videos shot by the Puerto Rican government to promote economic development and tourism in the island, but it will just be a backdrop. But this is the kind of images that the government is producing and has been producing for the past couple of years to kind of sell the island to investors and to tourists. The current economic crisis in Puerto Rico has been building for years, like one said, if not decades. It's directly tied to a political and economic model of dependency that came with the U.S. invasion in 1898, but it was also formally instituted in our Constitution when Luis Muñoz Marin prioritized the payment to bondholders or the guarantee of social services to our people, so that money would flood into our economy and he could carry out this plan of industrialization in the 1950s. The only thing that I would add to the explanation that Juan gave about how the Commonwealth Constitution came about is that there is a specific clause that states that payment to bondholders is a priority for the government before guaranteeing social services. That was the way in which he was able to guarantee investment in our economy in a moment where there was a particularly enormous project of industrialization and of moving people from the countryside to the cities, of establishing factories, etc. So that decision in and of itself, I think, is one of those very key points that you can see the immediate results of, or not the immediate, but you can see the results of them today in this crisis. And it's also one of the reasons why so many people trusted those bonds and invested in them. It has been picking up steam for the past 10 years, ever since Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code was allowed to expire by the U.S. Congress, like one said. And the house bubble bursting and the market crashes and the discovery of 30 years of unbalanced budgets came after, but only really added insult to injury. I can point out two positive consequences that the recent meltdown has brought about. First, the recognition beyond the shadow of a doubt of our colonial relationship to the United States. Secondly, the creation of a crisis big enough to draw the attention of the United States government and force them to deal with the case of Puerto Rico. These might not seem like a big deal, but they are. And trust me, we're not talking of the usual cognitive dissonance of, when a pro-statehood gubernatorial candidate claims to prefer independence to more of the same, or when a pro-Commonwealth government is mocked by the U.S. Supreme Court for thinking that they have any autonomy because of political maneuvering that happened 60 years ago. There's a major shift in discourse, both from Puerto Rican politicians and from the U.S. government. Our Constitution, which was designed to remove us from the United Nations list of colonies, and which politicians have defended for generations as some sort of special relationship that we should feel proud and protected by, has definitely been given several death blows in the last couple of years. The ideas and priorities that produce that Constitution, though, are still very present in our imaginary of what Puerto Rico is or who it's for. Those bonds that were sold to make Operation Bootstrap happen didn't just build factories and public housing projects. They also built hotels. They dismantled agriculture, and they Americanized our way of life. They established our current modes of consumption and our notions of progress. They created a country with an economy built on foreign capital, 85% dependent on highly taxed imports, with massive extractions of wealth in exchange for welfare and federal investment, and sold as a tropical paradise for visitors. This rhetoric of development is touted today as key to solving the same crisis that it helped create. The push is now for a visitors economy, and this is a quote, built on an ever-increasing service industry, a neoliberal campaign for entrepreneurship and innovation, and ridiculous tax incentives for millionaires to move to the island. So far, over 1,000 people have relocated to Puerto Rico using laws 20 and 22, which only requires them to live in the island for at least 183 days a year, with minimum employment and investment requirements. Originally, they had to employ 3 people. Now that's up to 5 throughout the course of several years. And minimum tax responsibilities. The main selling points repeated over and over in websites and brochures and conferences and cocktail parties being the protection of U.S. courts and laws, the bilingual, well-educated labor force, our infrastructure, luxury lifestyle amenities, good private schools, decent health care, exclusive beaches, and a great climate. I recently attended the Puerto Rico Investment Summit, thanks to a press pass, because the fee for Puerto Rican residents was $2,500. Because I was eager to see and listen to these investors and developers, speculators and entrepreneurs in person, speaking shamelessly about their self-interest and trying to convince others to join in on this venture. It was really kind of like being in a parallel dimension, full of the nauseating comments that you might imagine from gentrification pioneers or Wall Street investors here. John Paulson, for example, who made $4 billion from the subprime mortgage market while the world economy was spinning out of control, was there to entice everyone with the hotels that he's been buying up and convince them that, quote, Puerto Rico can be the Singapore of the Caribbean. I guess minus the uncomfortable time zone changes and the dictator. Online retail magnates like the owners of Shop.com and Market America, who are moving all their business to the island, even remarked at one point that, quote, when you do the numbers, you just can't afford not to be a Puerto Rican. So as long as Puerto Rico's subsistence depends on our ability to make business and life convenient to outside millionaires and tourists, Puerto Ricans' ability to thrive will continue to be threatened. I'm much more worried when I hear of the Williamsburg of Puerto Rico than the Greece of the Caribbean, and that is a very commonly used term, if you want to Google Williamsburg of Puerto Rico. And I don't think that I need to explain that in this audience. I'm sure you're all aware of what that probably means. But what's at stake there is not gentrification in the same way that we know it here, because there really is not enough local purchasing power to make it such, and the amount of abandoned and unused properties is still way too large. What this comparison points to is a population displacement. And the one quote that I could draw from to kind of just, which I think describes it in a really great way, is an article that just came out in the New York Times last week, where Elizabeth Jean-Pierre from Sunset Park describes what's happening in Sunset Park in Queens as, we call it a displacement economy. If we complain, they say we are against innovation and creativity. The way things are done now is being driven by corporate interests, not by community needs, end quote. So the people ushering in these investors are driven by short-term individual aspirations. They might very well be the next to leave the country or leave the public sector in exchange for consulting gigs within these newly established corporations. Meanwhile, for Puerto Ricans that have chosen to stay, there seem to be two options. The first one is to strive for a place in the ecosystem of these new arrivals, whether it's by selling them vegan pancakes or making their lattes or designing their locally made and impossibly priced home decorations, or like our economic development director recently suggested, providing catering through their private planes. The second is looking to develop survival strategies that change the consumption and production paradigm, whether it be by going back to agriculture and food production, focusing on sustainable living practices, occupying and transforming spaces, opening up small independent businesses, or even joining the underground economy. There might not be enough successful examples of these cases just yet, or they might be identified more as a scattered individual solutions than the collective decolonizing efforts that are so sorely needed. But in this recognition of a systemic, permanent crisis, and in this shift to resilience or resistance, really, as lifestyle, I think is where the ideas and hopes of another Puerto Rico are most evident. So there is some hope, after all.
Thank you, sister. Last but not least, I'm going to give it over to brother comrade Jose.
Good evening, all sisters and brothers. I think we need to establish at the outset something that has become rather obvious, that what Joseph Stiglitz referred to as the Greece of the Caribbean at a gathering of the Center for the New Economy in San Juan is actually a misnomer. What we are talking about is this is the Greece of the United States. This is America's Greece. And if we are clear in terms of that as the point of departure, we begin to understand what are the obligations of the U.S. federal government in terms of the creation of this crisis, and then the obligations they have in terms of finding solutions to this crisis. So this is not exclusively a so-called Puerto Rican problem, that is the Puerto Rican men and women who, as Sophia described very eloquently, are fighting for survival, but it's actually a collective solution that requires a will that we have never evidenced in the U.S. Congress. But that is why it's become fundamental to mobilize the will of the more than 5.2 million men and women who have made the U.S. mainland their home. And I hail from this place, this planet called Florida, where now there are more than 1 million Puerto Ricans, soon to exceed the Puerto Rican population here in the state of New York, and this is where the battleground will be fought. Because as some of you have heard, some of the presidential candidates have discovered that this Puerto Rican vote, particularly heavily concentrated in the so-called I-4 corridor between Tampa and Daytona Beach, can actually become the decisive vote in terms of the outcome of the presidential election and determining who will be the next inhabitant of the White House. So that is a wonderful opportunity that we couldn't discard, don't you think? So we want to make sure that we put the question of the debt and economic crisis of Puerto Rico front and center in terms of the choices that the people who are running for the presidency have to make. I have to say that two of them have come forward. Secretary Clinton was pushed by Senator Sanders, who was the first one to actually come out with a very sharp, clear position in terms of who is responsible for this and the need that Congress has to act in terms of this crisis. And the Republicans, you wonder where, if they live in this planet at all. Senator Rubio, who is fighting for his political life next Tuesday in the Florida election, has only spoken about his support of statehood. And in addition to that, he's made it known that he cares deeply about the fate of his friends in the hedge fund community, because obviously they are supporting his campaign. And the other fellow who was a candidate until recently, Jeb Bush, was discussing mostly the need for Puerto Rico to become the 51st State of the Union. He is no longer a candidate. And Dr. Carson, well, we wonder what planet he's been in all this time, and he's no longer in the race. Ted Cruz, who has this identity crisis, we don't know if he's Canadian or Cuban or a combination of both or what, but he certainly hasn't said boo about what's going on in Puerto Rico that we're aware of. And then comes in this other fellow called Trump, who has made repeated references to the properties he has in Puerto Rico, hotels, I think.
But he declared bankruptcy on some of those.
And he declared bankruptcy on some of those, and guess who paid the price, right? So this is a fascinating moment, as the Jesuits would describe the meaning of the moment, for us who can actually exercise our territorial right to vote by virtue of being in the U.S. Gloria, who works here in the Institute, was asking me at the beginning of this interesting exchange, how is it that we can actually, by jumping the Caribbean Sea and finding our way to Florida or New York City or to New Jersey or Connecticut, actually exercise our right to vote? Well, we have this thing called territorial citizenship, because you cannot vote for the President of the United States while you're in Puerto Rico, but if you get on a plane, JetBlue, which has become the preferred airline of the Ricans that are finding their way to Orlando and other places, you can actually exercise that right as long as you register to vote. So, for instance, we are looking forward to a huge rally that Senator Sanders is having in Orlando tomorrow, because we know that he's going to make lots of statements about the subject that we are discussing here. And that would most likely trigger other statements by Secretary Clinton, because she doesn't want to fall behind, particularly after the huge surprise that took place last night in the state of Michigan, which was the most wonderful thing that could ever happen in the presidential race so far. Yes, the diaspora can now claim to have a strategic role in defining perhaps what are some of the paths, some of the solutions to this crisis that we have been discussing. And the diaspora has been taking this quite seriously. There was a summit, a gathering on October 13 in Orlando that was attended by more than 250 men and women representing all kinds of organizations across the Puerto Rican communities in the U.S. Mainland. And we came up with a minimum program. One is the need, as Juan was talking about, to address the question of why is it that Puerto Rico cannot have access to bankruptcy protection. I mean, this inexplicably happened in the year of 1984. We still don't know how the hell that actually came about, but Puerto Rico does not have the same access that municipalities or states have to have some kind of bankruptcy protection that would allow it to begin to restructure its debt. Since it's not a national sovereign state, it cannot do what Argentina did and spend $40 million in litigating this in U.S. courts, because if it has $40 million, it should be thinking of using it to reopen some of the schools that were shut down as a result of the harsh austerity program that has been imposed on working families and the poor and the middle class in Puerto Rico. So it doesn't have that choice. And what is being presented in Congress nowadays is quite disturbing. Mr. Paul Ryan, who is the Speaker of the House, made a commitment that he will introduce comprehensive legislation to address the crisis. But let me tell you what he has in mind. What he has in mind is imposing a federal fiscal control board that will take the island back to the Foraker Act, to the days where Puerto Rico didn't even have, what some people describe as home rule or self-government. If you can claim that this thing called the Free Associated State, whatever the hell that means, is actually some form of self-government. I guess some people would argue that it is, but they are constantly reminded, as one was saying, that Puerto Rico is under the territorial clause. As a former governor was reminded recently, I think Governor Aníbal Acevedo Vilá was having a chat with Secretary Clinton about what is the real meaning of autonomy in the context of this thing called Commonwealth, and she reminded him quickly that Puerto Rico is still within the territorial clause. Right? And so he found, I think he wrote an article in the media, or he called a press conference to denounce that this was happening, and they announced that they would go to the United Nations, I think, to reclaim their autonomy. I think it would have been far more dignified to go and claim that Puerto Rico, it is what it is, a colony of the United States, and that it needs to exercise its right of self-determination. But Mr. Ryan, what he has in mind is imposing this federal fiscal control board, because in fact, as one was pointing out, they're quite concerned that their friendly creditors, right, the hedge funds and the mutual funds, they need to get paid. And also the possibility that there could be a catastrophic crisis in terms of the municipal bond market in the U.S. And so obviously that's one of the main motivations for them to come up with legislation that allegedly would address, the debt crisis of Puerto Rico. But they're not thinking about working families. They're not thinking about the 150,000 public service workers who stand to lose their pensions. If in fact, a judge is appointed to oversee this whole process, and the experience has been, as in Detroit and other places, that the first things to go are the public employees' pensions. And that is actually all that public employees have right now, because they have been under wage freezes for quite some time. They have been giving up, their benefits, and they stand to, see thousands and thousands of their sisters and brothers lose their jobs. If in fact the island declares bankruptcy as early as the end of May, as one was pointing out, which is the most likely scenario. So we have been forced to mobilize ourselves. We went to Washington, D.C. about 1,000 plus activists from all over the nation. We descended on the U.S. Capitol, and we met with all of these senators and members of Congress. Some of them were panicked when they saw some of our folks with these Puerto Rican flags floating all over the place. It was quite an interesting exchange with some of them who are, should be on the side of the people, right? Like, because they just happen to call themselves Democrats. So you would think that perhaps they have a more enlightened approach, to this question of the crisis. But we discovered that they haven't been thinking a lot about what goes on in this island in the Caribbean called Puerto Rico, unless, they have visited, have been on a cruise ship on occasion, of some of their friends, have enjoyed, the weather that we were looking at, that Sofia was showing on in terms of the promotion from the Puerto Rico government. We wish in the diaspora that there would be massive resistance and anti-austerity movement of the kind that exists in many other parts of the planet, and we wonder why that is not happening. And that it should be an interesting conversation. We wish that the governor of Puerto Rico, who is not running for re-election, would take a stand and say, hell no, I am not going to pay. Because it would be interesting. That would send shivers, up the spines of all these hedge fund managers and mutual funds. Why doesn't he do it? He's not running for re-election. He doesn't have anything to lose, right? Well, there must be an explanation somehow. It may follow the money. That may be the explanation. Follow the money. So just to close, we are determined to make this question one of the primary issues in the presidential election, and the first test is in the Florida primary next Tuesday. And si se puede, si se puede.
If I can just add a couple of things to some of the other comments that were made. I think that both the presentations raise important issues that we've got to deal with. The issue of why isn't there that much resistance, organized resistance in Puerto Rico? Well, I think one of the things that we've got to face is because of this enormous. I mean, you were saying 3,000 people a week. Yeah, 85,000 people left Puerto Rico last year. Do the math. There are more people leaving Puerto Rico now than there were at the height of the great migration in the 1950s, right? On a daily and a weekly basis. The folks on the island have been under so much. I mean, unemployment in Puerto Rico is 12.2%, right? Now, it would be higher if it wasn't for all the people who have left, but it's like depression levels, and people have been under so much austerity now for so long that you can understand why people will be driven down. But the reality is that the diaspora in the United States is the real force at this stage, not long term, but at this stage, because of the nature of the financial crisis. There's never been more attention to Puerto Rico in modern times. Maybe when Lolita Lebron and the Nationalists shot up to Congress, there was a lot more attention for a few days or a few weeks, but then it subsided. We have now been from July to now, almost an entire year with daily attention to Puerto Rico in the press, unprecedented in the history of the island. And there's also not only, there are more Puerto Ricans in this country now in positions of influence. There's 5 Puerto Ricans in the Congress. 5. Neri Velasquez, Luis Gutierrez, Jose Serrano, Raul Labrador, the Republican from Idaho, who is Puerto Rican, right? And Pedro Pierluisi, the non-voting resident commissioner, who gets to speak but not vote. So there are 5 Puerto Ricans in the Congress of the United States. Unfortunately, they can't all unite on what the best solution is, or how to approach it, but they have influence. They have influence. And you have all these, representatives at the state level, and you have all these community organizations. So really, the level of organization and influence is much greater in the Puerto Rican community in this country than it is in Puerto Rico right now. There's also a Puerto Rican on the Supreme Court. This is important to remember. There are 2 cases before the Supreme Court right now, both of which deal with the question is, what is the sovereignty of Puerto Rico? The one is a criminal case, a double jeopardy case, that is, the question is, does Puerto Rico have the right to prosecute a person for same crimes as the federal government? And that has already been argued before the Supreme Court. There's a second case that's going to be argued this month before the Supreme Court. And these decisions are going to come down in June. The second case is that the Puerto Rico government, because it did not have bankruptcy protection, decided in 2013 to pass its own bankruptcy law. The hedge funds went to court, in federal district court, and got the courts to say, no, the government, you're not allowed to do that according to federal law. So, and the lower courts have agreed, and then the appellate division, the appellate court in Boston agreed and overturned the Puerto Rico law, but now that's before the Supreme Court. Now what's happened in the last few weeks? Justice Scalia has passed away.
That's right.
Justice Alito has recused himself from that argument because he's got some kind of a conflict with some of the lawyers or maybe some of the litigants involved. So there's going to be 7 justices deciding the Puerto Rico sovereignty issue in a hearing that's going to be held in March and decided before June. So this, and there's no one more knowledgeable about sovereignty issues on Puerto Rico than Sonia Sotomayor. And so I have to think she's going to have quite a bit of an influence on the other judges and how to even begin to have the argument or the discussion on what the issue is about. What I'm saying is that Puerto Ricans in the United States at all levels have an opportunity to influence what Congress does in terms of Puerto Rico, perhaps more so than the people in Puerto Rico at this time. And therefore we should understand that that's an opportunity. That's a chance, whether it's in the presidential elections, where it's in marshaling forces on Congress, whether it's in the Supreme Court or whatever, there's going to be an opportunity to impact on this, and it has to be done soon. Because Ryan is talking about passing a bill by the end of March. Whatever his bill is going to be total control. It's going to be taking over Puerto Rico by remote control from here. But also, these other issues have to be resolved. So there's a lot that's going to happen in the next few months, and the main thing we have to do here in the United States is, one, get on top of the issues, understand what's at stake, what the basic thrust is, and then also, as I say, promote solutions to the crisis that strengthen the sovereignty of Puerto Rico as opposed to weakening the sovereignty of Puerto Rico. The one example that I raise constantly is the electric company. There's a separate debt battle over the Puerto Rico Electric Company known as PREPA. PREPA itself, it's a government-run electric company that owes $8.5 billion. Right? The hedge funds really want PREPA because in Puerto Rico everyone needs electricity. So they want to grab that sucker. They want to grab it separate from the rest of the deals that are being done on the other debt. And what they want to do is, right now Puerto Rico has about highest electric rates in the country except for Hawaii, because all of its electrical generation comes from about 60% from imported oil, about 30% from imported natural gas, and because of the Jones Act and everything else, that oil is expensive. It's gone down a little bit more because oil prices have gone down, but that's only temporary. So, but the hedge funds want to grab control of PREPA and have all liquefied natural gas imported. Now, what's the difference between liquefied natural gas and oil? It's just another fossil fuel, right? The real solution to PREPA, which was preserve the sovereignty of Puerto Rico, is sustainable energy. It's wind and sun. It's changing the entire electrical generation system of the island to wind and sun, of which the two are plentiful in Puerto Rico, because the trade winds are always blowing. But that means that on the island and here, sustainable energy advocates here have to take up the cause of Puerto Rico. Do not enslave Puerto Rico further for the next 20, 30, 40 years by forcing it to continue to import fossil fuels to run its electrical system. You've got to have a sovereign solution, a sustainable solution that keeps it right in Puerto Rico, the energy capacity, and cuts it loose from oil importation and natural gas importation. As long as you have to rebuild the system anyway, do it the right way this time. That's a battle for the environmental folks and sustainable energy folks to get behind and pressure here as well as there to change.
So we're going to take a few questions. My only request of the questions is that you keep it brief, so we have a chance to get together. And it would be okay if I just take a group of questions first, and then you can just allow the panelists to go.
There's the Univision debate tonight. We want to see it. You know?
Exactly. We'll be at time. We definitely that. So I'm going to say 1, 2, and then the brother in the back, all right? And then we'll take another round, okay?
Yeah, my name is Jesus Manuel Cruz, and I just translated this quick paragraph, and this is what it says in English. In 1961, and this was written by Jesus Davila, by the way, most of you know who he is. In 1961, Congress approved and President Kennedy signed an authorization that would elevate Puerto Rico's constitutional margin. The purpose of this authorization was to create a strategy for avoiding the legal limits of the money borrowed through loans. At the time, Puerto Rico's economy was very dynamic. Today we have the crisis that we have, and although most Puerto Ricans change in status, as far as I am concerned, a native born Puerto Rico of many generations, I feel that the only thing that will solve Puerto Rico's problem, economic and colonial, is that we change our political status as of now. If we negotiate anything else, we're going to seem like beggars every time we go to Washington. And I, as a Vietnam vet, having worked all my life, am not a beggar. That's what my take is.
Okay, so we're
I
going
do
to talk
not
about
beg anybody.
we're talking about the sister in the back and then the brother back there. Okay, the sister, no, you right there. You. No, not you. No, the sister right here.
Hi. Thank you so much. This was just really remarkable. Thank you all for such an edifying presentation. But I was hoping maybe you guys mentioned the Jones Act as a real kind of pivotal actor in this story, and I was hoping maybe you could talk about that a little bit more, just to sort of fill those of us in who don't know that history so well, and also maybe to give us a little bit more information on what the labor movement is like there, and sort of how a militant labor response could respond to the Jones Act, I don't know, independent of the AFL-CIO, or?
Yeah. I could take a quick stab at the question of the role of unions, and perhaps Sophia and Juan can address the broader implications of the Jones Act. The story is very simple. I mean, it has to do with the maritime, unions that are affiliated to the AFL-CIO, the International Longshoremen Union, to name perhaps the most important one. And so it's a question of narrow self-interest, if you ask me. But I think that the Puerto Rican trade union movement, which is led for the most part by many progressive people who are committed to an anti-austerity approach, and have been trying in different ways to actually build such a movement that Sophia was referring to, are also caught in the dilemma of reform versus revolution. Are you familiar with that dilemma? That Rosa Luxemburg had a lot to do with that dilemma, right, Albert? And the question is, if you're trying to avert a humanitarian crisis, and you are trying to make sure that you don't lose another 10 or 15,000 or 20,000 jobs, just to illustrate how this plays out in the real human drama. When I was a trade union leader there in the island, and the first massive layoff under Governor Fortuño, which he had announced 30,000 initially, and then it turned out to be something closer to half of that. I met several families who, both couples, the man and the woman, were public service workers, and they were laid off. Some of them committed suicide. And I found myself in delivering, what is the word, the eulogy, is that the eulogy, which was the most horrendous thing that I could ever think in my life, because that's the human price. You know, that a couple that decided that they would take their lives. And so, this is the dilemma that many trade unions find themselves, finding the solutions to be able to accommodate the immediate needs of their members. Recently, there was another huge dilemma. The payment of the bono de Navidad, the Christmas bonus, right? That the governor announced he would be able to pay the Christmas bonus, but guess where he found the money to pay the Christmas bonus? He dipped his hands in the pension plans, which several governments have rated the pension plans, which are, they're totally underwater, right? And so, public service workers were offered, the so-called choice: do you take a Christmas bonus, or do you sustain or allow for the possibility that perhaps your pension plan, could be preserved? Can you imagine, choices like that? And so I suppose that many trade union leaders who would be really committed to building a mass resistance and anti-austerity movement are faced with choices like that constantly. There is recently a new formation, Vamos, is it Vamos, Sofia, that includes not only trade unions, but actually a broader, community organizations and other formations that it's promising, from my perspective, but those are really the choices that are made. The AFL-CIO is simply, ¿cómo se dice? Inamovible en inglés.
Unmovable?
Unmovable. Is there such a word in the English language? I mean, they're simply, we had, when we were having the meeting of the diaspora organizations, we chose to have our meeting in the AFL-CIO building about a month and a half ago. The first question that came up was the question of what to do with the Jones Act. And they were horrified. The people from the AFL-CIO who were there, were almost, ready to run out of the room because of the, obligations they feel in terms of their affiliates. So it's a very, very serious question. And I just can't see, other than building a mass movement in the island, and certainly here, putting the heat on Congress, I just can't see any other way of addressing it,
On the issue of what the Jones Act basically represents is, after World War I, the United States government was trying to figure out how do you preserve a merchant marine fleet? Because, the merchant marine fleet, your ships in times of war is what you use to ship goods in. You militarize your fleet. So the government passed a law that any cargo being transported from one U.S. port to another U.S. port has to be on a ship that was built in the United States, that is manned by American crews, and it's a U.S. flagship. Those built in the U.S., U.S. flag, and U.S. crews. Those are the three. If you're going from one port to another. So since Puerto Rico is technically part of the United States, therefore everything that goes into and out of Puerto Rico must be on a U.S. ship, U.S. flag, and U.S. manned. The entire world is flying Liberian and Panamanian flag cargo ships with Greek and Cypriot crews, all getting paid the lowest possible wages. And they're being built in South Korea and Japan. That's who's building ships these days, South Korea and Japan. So what's happened is the U.S. merchant marine fleet is not competitive on the world scale. The only way that the U.S. merchant marine fleet exists is because Puerto Rico, tiny little Puerto Rico, now represents 25% of the entire cargo of the American merchant marine fleet. Even though it represents something like 2% of the economy, it represents 25% of the entire business of the U.S. merchant marine fleet. So Puerto Rico is in effect subsidizing the existence of a U.S. merchant marine fleet. All right, but the result of that is that because the cost of the ships and the labor is so much greater, every car in Puerto Rico, everything that's imported out costs more than if you get it here in the United States. So it's driving up the cost of all goods in Puerto Rico 15-20%. The government estimates it's about $600 million a year in excess costs that the Puerto Rican people are paying for the maintenance of the Jones Act. So all you had to do is get rid of the Jones Act, and prices in Puerto Rico would drop, right? But Congress refuses to do it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I know there's also been a push in Guam and in Alaska to repeal the Jones Act. I know
Yes.
Alaska has waivers because of oil.
Alaska has
Because
waivers, and the Virgin Islands has waivers also
Yeah.
because of oil, because there was a refinery built in the Virgin Islands in the 70s, and they wanted to be, and it was some business, I forget the businessman who owned the refinery, I think it was Hess or something like that, and they got Congress.
Hess oil.
Hess Oil, they got Congress to pass a waiver for the Virgin Islands, but Puerto Rico, there's no influence to get a waiver from the Jones Act.
And the other thing that I would add is because 85% of what we consume in Puerto Rico is imported, that has a huge impact. And that's why I also brought up the fact that local production, for example, local food production, has become a really important issue and very talked about. And I think that a lot of people that are seeing the way that this is unfolding, especially a lot of young people, are kind of looking towards agriculture as a way of pushing forward another kind of economic model.
I'd also like to address what Jesus said, because I think that's a big source of conflict in the movement to save Puerto Rico, the long-term solution versus the immediate concern. I completely agree with you that the status issue has to be resolved. There's no doubt about that. The problem is that, unfortunately, as you well know, this debate has been going on among the Puerto Rican people now for 100 years, and there's no agreement among the Puerto Rican people as to how that status should be resolved. In addition to that, you have the reality that national independence no longer means what it used to mean. In the interconnected and global world that we live in today, it's entirely possible to control a country from afar, and through your bank transfers to your credit lines. You don't have to have troops. The United States has pulled out almost all its military out of Puerto Rico, when it used to have 13% of the entire island military. It no longer needs the military bases to control the island. And so that, on the one hand, I agree with you, we got to resolve the problem, but there's an immediate crisis that somehow has to be addressed. But that's why I favor finding solutions for the immediate crisis that don't contradict the need to push for Puerto Rico sovereignty. That you've got to have a recognition of the sovereignty of the island by the United States, rather than a diminishing of the sovereignty of the island.
Can I just quickly reply to that?
Yeah, we just have a number of questions, so this, it'll be time to, but there'll be time to talk afterwards, because I'm gonna make sure that people have time. All right, so I'm gonna take one and two.
And I think there was someone over there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had you before. I'm sorry.
Supposed to
sorry
go in the
about-
original.
Yeah, I apologize.
Thank you for bringing to conversation, thank you for your time, General. Thank you for bringing to conversation why there's not mobilization, why there's not a movement. I think that's something that gets lost when we're talking about the numbers and all the debt. And I wanted to ask more about about the trade unions, but we already covered it. I don't know if somebody could talk about how they are connected, how the UAW, they asked me, they have so much influence in Puerto Rico, as far as mobilization in the unions, and how that might be, affecting, because maybe, there's not enough pressure to the heads of the unions there, or what is happening in that sense there. And then coming from there, what is the conversation of the diaspora with the people in Puerto Rico? It's with the, and I mean like activists, maybe the political parties, the minor political parties, have the Emerging Workers Party and the independents party which has a big infrastructure to decades. So what are the conversations? Because I feel like I hear arguments from the diaspora which are very good, and I hear arguments from the Puerto Rican political leaders, leftist leaders, which are very good, but I don't feel that they're connected. So I would like to get them in this conversation here.
And before we jump in, I was taking one question with the brother Naved.
I was the first one.
Go ahead.
Okay, hello everybody. I wanted to say first of all, one of the things that I agree upon is that we have to, one was pointed out, was the one of the things that Juan Gonzalez was pointing out is that we have to take a multi-pronged approach. Like he was talking about the activism with the environment, like Vieques, Reverend Sharpton and others. You might debate that that he did one positive thing, but the fact is that I really think that it was punitive, and they're punishing Puerto Rico for removing the military from Puerto Rico. And so that's a theory of mine, but I really do feel also too that what we need in Puerto Rico is, and I wanted to say for the record, I'm a member of National Action Network, and I want to tell you that I'm the only Puerto Rican in the Harlem. I've been a member for 6 years, and I feel comfortable. And so it's not a white or black issue; it's what's right. And I really think that Reverend Sharpton would like for you, if you'd like to, present at the Saturday morning rally. I was there, and I presented something for Hispanic Heritage Month, and I picked the Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor of Puerto Rican. What I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have to get other people, white and black, involved in this issue. It's just not about Puerto Ricans. So, just like the Young Lords and was an offshoot of the Black Panthers, I think that we need to get everybody involved. And I think a great way to doing it is if you ask Reverend Sharpton to, because he has a large audience of Black Americans, Black, Felipe Luciano says that we're all Africans. But anyway, I will also want to say that we have our Puerto Rico's natural resources, and it makes me feel sad because we have so many brilliant Puerto Ricans, and so it's our resources, the musicians, the scientists, like Juan Gonzalez, and we have inventors, and like you, sister, that came from Puerto Rico, and I want to just hand it to you. You really know your stuff, and I am proud of you.
Thank you.
But I'm also that kind of Puerto Rican. So I wanted to be utilized. So I don't feel comfortable. There's no organization that we should have a Puerto Rican National Action Network, and maybe Al Sharpton would like to do one in Puerto Rico. I'll run it. I admit it. So I think, Juan, what I would like you to, that's a solution. So it's okay to state the problem, and for me, it's about, okay, so what's the solution? I think Juan he can't do it by himself, but I think we need to involve everybody in it. And so since Reverend Al Sharpton, what I'm trying to say is that we need a Martin Luther Puerto Rican. And I'm up for it. Yeah, Martin Luther Puerto Rican. Thank you.
I just want to refer to a New York Times article came out on Friday, February the 26th, and it says Treasury officials urges relief for Puerto Rico, but lawmakers fear fallout. And this is the current Obama administration. This is the Treasury Department official. And the Treasury also wants Puerto Rico to have an oversight board to monitor its budgeting and fiscal planning and make sure it issues truthful financial statements on schedule. Mr. Weiss said the two provisions for restructuring regime and for an oversight board were both essential. So it seems that this, whether it's Ryan or whether it's the administration, the President Obama, it's the same final solution. And Juan, I want to ask the panel, incidentally identify me. My name is Roberto Rivera. Okay, bro. And I want to ask, what will default look like?
Default.
Well, first of all, about the oversight board, yeah, that's the White House proposal. They proposed an oversight board because they know that they're not going to get anything out of the Congress unless they agree to some kind of an oversight board. However, their definition of an oversight board is very different from the control board that the Republicans are talking about. The Republicans, both Orrin Hatch in the Senate and Ryan in the House, are talking about a 5-member control board appointed by the president of people from the United States that would have the final say on the budget and on the expenditures of the island. That's a total financial takeover. Antonio Weiss, when he testified before Congress, said that the Obama administration believes in an oversight board, but one that would respect the autonomy and the self-government of the island of Puerto Rico. They would at least insist that it be a majority people from the island, and two, that it not have direct control over the finances, in essence usurping the local legislature and local senate, but would be able to audit the books and issue reports on how that was being done. So that's an attempt by the Obama administration to find some way to win support in a Republican-controlled House and Senate for some kind of a restructuring bill. It's not desirable, but it's not as bad as it sounds compared to what the Republicans are proposing, which is an outright direct takeover of the island's finances.
And what would the fault look like?
But the oversight board that Antonio Weiss and Secretary Lew are proposing doesn't stand a chance of a snowball in hell in Congress, frankly speaking, because of the obvious. I mean, the Republicans control all of the committees. They run the House, they run the Senate, and so the fear. And I think that there is a very strong consensus. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sophia. That includes all political persuasions in the island against a federal control board that would take us back, to those days of blatant colonialism. Although, I wonder sometimes one of the gubernatorial candidates doesn't even seem to be thinking a lot about these things, and he may have a shot at becoming the governor, I hear. Of the island, if some people have their way. So, you wonder what could happen. But once again, I suspect that this will be left up to the next president of the United States, frankly speaking. Because if the choice is the kind of control board that they are proposing, every attempt ought to be made to make sure that that legislation is killed and derailed. That it doesn't pass, so that we can have a shot at either Bernie Sanders' presidency. Does that sound interesting? Right? Or a Hillary Clinton presidency? Certainly not a Donald Trump presidency, because God knows what will be, the outcome of something like that. But that's my sense, that this doesn't really have much of a chance.
Well, but where I would differ with Jose on that is that I don't believe it's going to wait until the next president gets elected.
That something is going to be passed.
I think that I think that the reality is that my sense at this point is that Puerto Rico has no choice but to default, and that it is going to happen either in May or certainly in July. The question then becomes, as you were saying, what does default look like? And at that point, it's going to be absent any bankruptcy protection. It's going to be a complete free-for-all.
Yeah.
You're going to have so many cases by individual bond holders, especially the hedge funds, tying up the courts, and then the government with no money having to do even more massive layoffs and more cutbacks than they've already made. And you're going to have a tremendous instability in the bond market of the United States. So that I think that the reality is that politicians sometimes don't understand that they can't control things. The market forces have already been unleashed, and if you don't adopt the policies at the time you need to adopt them, you're going to have to face the consequences. Which I think there's going to be an extremely messy default in Puerto Rico starting in a few months. So I think that at that stage, and what's going to become the center of attraction? U.S. bankruptcy court right here in southern Manhattan, at the in lower Manhattan, is going to be the main place where the Battle of Puerto Rico takes place. And with all the creditors coming in, trying to get their piece of the action, because everybody's bonds are guaranteed by something, right?
It's a general obligation.
Yeah.
That's general obligation bonds, but then there are COFINA bonds.
Yeah.
COFINA bonds are bonds that's 15 billion of them, which are guaranteed by the sales tax that the people of Puerto Rico pay. So
Which was just raised.
which was just raised from 7 to 11.5%. In Puerto Rico, they pay 11.5% sales tax, and that money is pledged to pay the COFINA bondholders first. So they're going to go to court for their bond money. Then there is the PRASA bonds. The Puerto Rico, the Sewer and Water Authority. Those bonds are guaranteed by the water rates that people pay. There's the PREPA bonds that are guaranteed by the electrical rates that people pay. There are the Puerto Rican Highway and Toll Authority bonds that are guaranteed by the tolls that people pay. Everything is pledged. There's revenue pledges for all of these bonds from the different public corporations of the government, in addition to the government's general obligation bonds.
Could they be forced to sell assets?
That's what the bondholders, the bondholders are going to say, you have money, you have the assets. Give me control of the electric company. Give me control of the highways, because you owe it to me, and your revenues were pledged to pay my debt. So there's going to be all of these legal battles individually, and unlike in a normal bankruptcy situation where one judge does a universal settlement with everyone, the bondholders are all going to be fighting in court individually, separately. And the Puerto Rico government is going to have to shell out money to lawyers for all of the cases to defend all the cases. So it's going to be total
So it
chaos.
sounds like default is not a good option.
Well, you know what? Sometimes you don't have an option. And actually,
It's not a good option because it causes like more massive riots,
yeah, and it's like, well, and it's like when you don't have the money, what can you do? Right? That's the issue.
Maybe arson,
Well, one second. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's a stack here, so I just want to make sure that everyone gets the proper chance. So this brother's been having his hand raised, so him, and then you back there in the gray sweater, all right?
Can I add just a
Yeah,
little,
really
very
quick,
quick thing, since Jose consulted me on it. I had a conversation very recently with a plumber who does agree with the Financial Control Board, with the Fiscal Control Board, and I just want to say that, hey, it's one plumber for 120 years, and there are plenty of people in Puerto Rico that think that this is an administration problem, and that this debt crisis is solely the fault of corrupt politicians handing out contracts to friends and overspending. And there's plenty of senators and legislators that have come out in the press and said, this is like if you have a credit card and you spend too much, and the conversation about this debt crisis in terms of the political analysis has been really superficial, and because there's so much specialized language involved in understanding this, I'm so glad that Juan is here, because he's been able to really hash out a lot of these details that are really difficult to comprehend. But most people in Puerto Rico don't easily handle all those facts, and so they understand much more quickly that that there is a long history of corruption and bad administration in Puerto Rico, that that the U.S. seems like a country that works just fine, and that perhaps an expert council that is going to come and impose measures is just going to be doing good administering, and I think that is unfortunately the thinking of a lot of people. And it's important to recognize that, that there is a lot of people, even people that are not necessarily pro-statehood, that do think that, that is the way to solve this, to put it in the hands of the U.S. government. So I just wanted to bring that up, because it's an unfortunate reality, and understanding how that mentality comes about or where that comes from allows us to is important to also understanding how a lot of this situation in general is playing out, and the fact that, for example, the Treasury Department, among its recommendations, is recommending to invert that clause in the Constitution that prioritizes bond payments over pensions, and is saying it's really important that we protect pensions, because that's the only place where if people keep leaving, there's no tax basis. it's absurd that Treasury, that the U.S. Treasury Department is suggesting that, and like Jose said, our governor, who's not running for re-election, has not come out and said that. There's no courage in the political class in Puerto Rico right now. There's no courage to say any of these things, and partly is because as you can imagine, but part of it is precisely again because of this colonial mentality, and unfortunately I don't, I don't support any of these bodies coming and intervening and imposing measures in Puerto Rico, but unfortunately there is a history also of the federal government imposing some of the most liberal public policy. There would be no right to abortion in Puerto Rico if it wasn't imposed by the federal government. There'd be a death penalty in Puerto Rico if it wasn't because it's been imposed by the federal government not to, and so there is a history and a relationship, and the presence of the federal government in Puerto Rico is constantly seen as a presence that fiscalizes, that holds politicians accountable for corruption, that holds corrupt policemen accountable for corruption. There's also a history of the federal government being very violent and persecuting activists and everything, but there's that complexity. There's that complexity.
He had a question.
Yeah.
Good evening. I have like a different perspective on this because I did live on the island for 28 years. I worked in manufacturing. I worked in pharmaceutical. The last job I had was in telecommunications. So we saw this, we knew this was going to happen, and a lot of people kept quiet. I participated in both political parties. We knew this was going to happen. And that issue was never brought out. So my comment is, I would love to see this brought out completely. Yes, the corruption. Paying Tren Urbano $2 billion, and it's only 6 stops. Okay? Just the...
Hey, New York built the 7-line extension, 1 stop for $3 billion.
That's what the corruption is. The corruption in Prepa.
Yeah, the only solar farm, sorry, I was going to say this earlier. The only solar farm in Puerto Rico is private, government subsidized, but it's a private solar farm that is used to run a coal power plant. That is the only solar farm I've ever seen in Puerto Rico. It's huge. There were at least I think like $70 million in government subsidies to build it, and it's used to run a coal power plant.
My 2 questions are, one is for you. You should take a few minutes and explain the cinema industry in Puerto Rico and how it's been abandoned. Okay?
That's even
compared to other
complicated.
Then for you, the question I have, Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico have a high voter turnout. It's been proven in New York that we don't have a high voter turnout. So I think the campaign should be that we need to get out to North Dakota where there's 937 Puerto Ricans and say, you know what, we need to have 90% of you getting out to vote. So my question again, can you explain briefly about the Puerto Rico cinema industry, and then what is the expectation of Central Florida and Puerto Ricans voting?
Okay, before we go, exactly. Before we hit that, it is 8 o'clock. Do you mind if I take a couple more, and then we'll just use
Do it.
All right, so
And remember, don't even
see it,
debate.
and I have to cut it off. And there'll be time for folks to stick around and talk afterwards, okay?
And
So,
that was an answer.
yeah, exactly. I'm gonna bring that one back. I didn't forget about you.
It's true.
And it's connected actually
I don't
to this
think
question
I'm the
of
person.
wait, hold up. So, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm also a resident of Puerto Rico. Speak up.
I can't hear you.
Buenas noches. Hi. My name is Mirna Rivera. I'm an investment advisor. I work in Puerto Rico, and I also chair the Foundation of Living College, so I'm back and forth between New York and San Juan. As an investment advisor, as an investment professional, I'd like to contribute to this very interesting debate some information. Number one, to the question about why doesn't the government of Puerto Rico say let's default on the debt, we have to understand that a large part of the debt is in the hands of Puerto Ricans and Puerto The credit unions in Puerto Rico have $1 billion in debt. There's 111 credit unions that represents over 1 million people, which is a very massive voting base in Puerto Rico. And they have just been able to renegotiate how they're going to do the accounting of these bonds because they stand to lose over close to $1 billion. So there's a lot, the hedge funds have come to the process only very recently. They own about 12%, well, less than 10% actually of the debt, but and they've bought most of the debt at very big discounts.
Yep.
And then there are the rest of us who have bought them at par.
Yep.
And so there's a very big difference between the hedge funds who have a lot of money to do a lot of the media that you're seeing, to pay for a lot of the media coverage. There's also a lot of economic capacity to do the sort of lobbying that we have been seeing and so on and so forth. And then there's the silent majority that doesn't have that kind of financial resource, which actually owns most of the. Puerto Ricans don't own most of it, but they own a substantial component of it. It's about $14 billion of the $70 billion is owned by individual Puerto Ricans who are either retired persons or through mutual funds in Puerto Rico. So I just wanted to share that information with you. A question that I have that I would invite all of us to ponder is who built the bonds and in whose best interest was it to build all of this debt? And I think there's an area to be explored that doesn't get talked about anywhere, which is the role of the investment banking industry and the role of the credit agencies in this drama. It's pretty common knowledge, and clearly here as well, which is very cool as far as I'm concerned, that Puerto Rico has been financing operational deficits for the last 10 or 12 years. So at a recent panel in Puerto Rico where I had an opportunity to share with the gentleman from Moody's, my question to Moody's was, why did you downgrade us before? Why was 70 billion an ugly number? Why wasn't 50 billion an ugly number? Why wasn't 30 billion an ugly number? Why didn't you downgrade us before? And so I think there's a question that I would invite all of us to explore, which is, whose best interest was it to drive the debt? If in Puerto Rico, after 1936, the Electric Power Authority and the Water Authority and the Building Authority lost its biggest clients. And as those clients walked out, they still needed to pay their fixed expenses, and so it was a layup for the investment banking industry to come in and say, let's finance the debt because this is a temporary emergency. And here we are, it wasn't a temporary emergency.
Yeah, I'm gonna stand there. I'm gonna take a round of questions, but the brother in the back, and then I'll go around, the quick round. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Sal Lafizo, and I really didn't expect to talk tonight. To be honest with you, I just wanted to hear because there's so much going on in this country and across the planet. With a guy like Trump that's bringing it all out, put it on the street, and everybody's talking about it, and it hits on each thing that each one of you has said. And this is what I think of every day in my life. And it follow the money. That's the bottom line. When you follow the money, they're not going to do shit unless they can't make a nickel over it. If you change that mentality that they're not going to make a nickel in Puerto Rico, they're not going to be there. They'll go to Haiti, they'll go somewhere else, or they'll do. But the main thing is that it's the same mindset in the United States as it is in Puerto Rico. When people think, well, the government will change it, or it's the government's fault, and it's prettier in the United States. But what happens is, when people leave Puerto Rico, come to El Barrio, they forget about where they came. And that's not just them, it's everybody. We don't want to look back. We just have this thing, we don't want to look back, we're afraid to look back. Instead of, some guys will reach back, right, and help and say that's my country, but they don't want to live there anymore. And that's what happens, and New York does that. It doesn't do that in other parts of the country because they're really just living in a shell. They're living in a bubble, they just want to get out. And that's why they'll rally for a guy like Trump that doesn't make any goddamn sense. He just talks shit. He knows it's a reality show. He's going to get his vote. But people that live in metropolises like us, we get it. We're not afraid of the guy next door. We don't need a gun. So that's the mentality. But what I really believe with activists and with people that really give a shit, it's a different game today. We can't just get out there and march and have thousands of people out there and then go home and say, I marched yesterday and put it on Facebook. That shit don't get it anymore.
Yeah.
They are too controlling. They have power, like you say, remote control.
Yeah.
They can control you in China. You know, that's the deal. That's the environment we're in. And we have to understand that. We really have to take grasp of that. That we have to infiltrate them, not just bump their heads. I was in the street doing, you know, the whole thing of Black Lives Matter. And
Sí,
I'm
sí.
like saying to myself, what the frick am I doing, you know, because I did this in the 60s. You know, I'm looking at it and I'm saying we have to do it in a different way. People have to understand that we have to infiltrate them. We have to flip it on them, that they're not in control. That we have to do that. And we have to, and we have to, those guys that you're talking about that are economists that are Puerto Rican, okay, you got up there. Now what are you going to do for your people? All right? What do you get in their face? We have to turn that around. You see a cop in the street, a big black cop, you got to tell them, like, what are you doing? Well, any nationality. I'm not just picking on, you know, nationalities, but it's a mindset. I'm getting carried away. So I just want to thank you all for having this. I feel like this is across the board. It's not just Puerto Rico, but the issue is Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one last comment right over here, really quickly.
Just one comment as an architect who is a representative of the biggest deficit in modern history. I just wanted to make a comment about hedge fund role and the less than 10% comment that the lady there said. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. I wanted to say as an Argentine that the hedge funds held the 3% of the Argentinian debt, and that debt was of 3,800 millions, and that 3%, only 3%, allowed them to collect $12 billion a few days ago. So that hedge fund is very dangerous, whether it's at 3, 10, or 8%.
Okay. So I just want to turn it back to the panelists and finish up with the questions that I think really kind of segue. How do we utilize the energy to mobilize both on the island and also here? Also, the brother in the back also talked about the role of the smaller political parties, how to fuse them together. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about the media in this Puerto Rican cinema.
We owe him a response.
Yeah. You want to start?
I don't know if I'm the person to answer your question though. I don't know if I have the answer, honestly. I mean, the only part about your question that I feel like maybe I could say something about is that relationship between movements, you know, in the U.S. and movements in Puerto Rico, or people that are caring and talking and mobilizing in any form or, you know, shape or form about this in both places. And I think you're totally right that there's a huge disconnect, you know, and that there is no direct collaboration happening. I mean, there's very little happening in terms of mobilization in Puerto Rico at all, honestly. And like I said, there's even like a first level, like a very base level work of educating people about what is happening that is just a huge important task in and of itself, because as most people can't understand, can't quite grasp like what all of these things entail and like really mean and what are the consequences, there's not going to be a smart, articulate discourse that can be built across ideologies or party lines or movements. But yeah, I think that what Juan said earlier also about how, you know, because the Puerto Rican community has grown and established itself and has gotten themselves into positions of power and has created institutions, and, you know, all of this time has passed, that there is, you know, a much bigger influence and power that Puerto Rican communities in the States can have right now. But it's also the first time that, you know, that it would happen at this scale, or, you know, or in this way. And so it's also being built as it's need, you know, there's an urgent need for it, and it's kind of, those coalitions are being built as it happens, you know. So it's you know, I'm curious about what the primary is going to look like, for example, on Tuesday.
Yeah. The scenario that, and I was, when Roberto raised the question of the default scenario, which I have to confess I find it intriguing, okay, to say the least. I mean, it's going into the twilight zone, right? But what it would trigger offers tremendous possibilities, I think, right? Because here's what's going to happen. Paul Ryan is going to come up with legislation. And the legislation is going to include a very stringent form of control in the form of that emergency fiscal control board. And I wonder if we would have sufficient influence to stop that, given the fact that the lobbies that somebody was referring to, I mean, the DC is just there is an army, a virtual army of lobbyists who are making big bucks on this whole crisis in Puerto Rico, who are exercising tremendous amount of influence, and they don't care about the Puerto Rican people or working families or poor people in Puerto Rico, and less about Puerto Ricans in the U.S. mainland. They just want to make sure that the creditors get paid. I don't know if we would have sufficient strength to derail the legislation or even to kill it, to rally enough Democrats. I know it's very difficult to envision the possibility or the likelihood of persuading some Republicans, because they seem to be very consistent and coherent and solid as a bloc. But I would much rather, see the scenario. Is that a scenario you favor, by the way, Juan? The default scenario that it would trigger all kinds of ramifications. I mean, I often wonder, because the possibilities are immense, but the risk and the pain are also immense in terms of what would happen to families in the island, and if the response of people is going to continue to be to vote with their feet at the rate of the 3,000 or 1,000 we cannot tolerate. And I think that the commitment of the diaspora so far is to rally behind something that is a little more benign, if there is such a thing. But if it doesn't happen, I don't think that we have any other choice than to try to kill whatever comes out of Congress. I don't think we have any other choice. And I think the governor will attempt to cut a deal with Ryan and the Republicans so that there is some form of payment that people begin to organize with the creditors, and that is also a deadly scenario, really. It's like having a gun, put on your head in terms of the choices for, the families that are going to be affected by this. So if anybody has any other ideas, please, this is the espresso moment, because I just fail to see it. I don't know, Juan, have you been thinking about this?
Well, I mean, I have a cousin who is in investment, and we were at Thanksgiving, at Thanksgiving dinner in November. And she's actually an expert on Puerto Rico, and because she worked with a hedge fund that's heavily invested in Plaza bonds, right? And so she knows all the players. And we were talking back and forth at Thanksgiving dinner, and she says to me, Juan, I don't know why they just don't default. I work with these folks every day. The only language they understand is when you don't pay, because at that moment, then they have to negotiate. See, because we're not just talking about $70 billion in bonds. There's $40 billion in unfunded liabilities to the pension funds of the Puerto Rico workers. So the government of Puerto Rico really owes $110 billion. $70 billion to the bondholders and $40 billion that it's promised to its workers that it doesn't have. And so the question is, who's going to suffer? And also, because those were contracts too. Those were contracts too to these workers, and the workers were less savvy when they bought into the pension system than were the investors who bought the bonds, whether it's the big investors or the little investors, because even little investors have some kind of level of savvy compared to the big investors. The other thing is the numbers. No one really knows how much of the debt is owned by the hedge funds at this point. I heard Antonio Weiss in Congress say the administration believes 30% of the debt is now owned by by hedge funds. Now that's the White House speaking. I don't know where they got their information from, but that was the testimony that he gave in Congress. One thing is certain: the last tranche of debt, which was $3.5 billion, floated in March of 2014, are almost all owned by the hedge funds, because at that point, Puerto Rico had been so downgraded that nobody else was buying its debt. And those are general obligation bonds guaranteed by the Constitution of Puerto Rico, and you can bet that Blue Mountain Capital and everybody else who was part of that buying up that debt will be the ones, like you were saying before, that litigate to the end, because they are the ones that last in, and they feel they have the biggest guarantees. So regardless of what proportion of the debt is owned, I believe that the hedge funds will control the negotiations from the creditor's point of view. Now, Oppenheimer and Templeton, who have the mutual funds and who have a lot of the little bondholders, they also are major players. But I think that the hedge funds are going to be the ones that are going to be the most resistant to any kind of settlement where they don't get the max of their money. So even though they may not have the huge portion of the debt, they have sort of the controlling power. And I think that again, I go back to the simple when you how can you pay what you don't have? You know, and so at a certain point, you have to the government has to be able to tell, look, you knew what you were doing. You invested in this money. Yes, there were guarantees, but we don't have the money. So let's work it out. Let's work it out where you reduce how much. It's the same thing with the mortgage crisis. You know, why wasn't principal reduced for all these homeowners when the prices of these houses were inflated? It's not just a question of restructuring how long you're going to pay the debt. You have to reduce the principal that you're supposedly you're going to be in hock for the rest of your life. So I think it's a question of, but you got to be hard-nosed enough to risk what happens when you go down that route, because otherwise you're going to take it out on your own people. You know, you're going to have to take it out, and it's going to come from somebody. The money's going to come from somebody. And I think that yes, there has to be a default. And then we'll pick up the pieces after the default. You know, but who am I? I'm not a financial expert.
All right, well, I want to thank our panelists tonight. This is wonderful. And thank you so much. I would definitely encourage people to check out the website, rosalux-nyc.org. We have a bunch of studies or publications at the back, lots of videos. We'll be following this issue. Also following the issue of Puerto Rico. Is there a website for Stand with Puerto Rico? Yeah. What's the website there? Yeah. It's out of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. Right. Yeah, that's where the website. That is Stand. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you guys so much.